In the cradle of civilization, nothing was stable. Not the rivers, not the gods, not even the ground beneath their feet. Yet the people of Mesopotamia built cities and laws and meaning out of all that chaos. Welcome to History Unraveled with Dr. Duncan. I'm your host, Dr. Duncan, and today we're taking a deeper look at the oldest city-building civilization. Because before Greece, before Rome, even before the pyramids of Egypt, there was Sumer, a region of mud brick cities and monumental temples, of kings and gods, of war and writing, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is today modern-day Iraq. This cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia, or the land between two rivers, was home to first the Sumerians, then the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, and others who pioneered many of the cultural and political foundations of the ancient world. The unpredictable nature of the Tigris and the Euphrates, coupled with the lack of natural barriers, made Mesopotamia a place of uncertainty and danger. Cities could rise to prominence and fall into ruin. It was a deeply religious world where gods and demons were seen behind every flood, every drought, and every failed harvest, making the temple both a sacred space and an engine of economic control. There were law codes carved in stone that offered both justice and brutal punishment. In this episode, we'll explore the culture and society of ancient Mesopotamia, mostly focusing on the Sumerians, who set the foundation not just for the many subsequent kingdoms and empires in the Fertile Crescent itself, but its creation and development extended far beyond to regions like Egypt, the Mediterranean, and even the Indus Valley civilization. And as we consider the structure and significance of the Sumerian cities and the civilization that came with it, we will note the impact of geography on the culture and commerce and politics and religion of this area. The Mesopotamians left us their legacy etched into the clay tablets they left behind. They include records of contracts, hymns, omens, and laws that offers a remarkably vivid window into their world. Join me as we peer through that window to better understand the first civilization. As we mentioned in the previous episode, the first true cities in human history emerged in southern Mesopotamia in a region called Sumer. Because of the non-Semitic language of the Sumerians, they were likely migrants from the east, possibly northern India. Though their origins are a mystery, their language is unrelated to any other known language, living or dead, so tracing them back to their first homeland is impossible. Regardless of where they came from, they settled in the marshy plains of southern Mesopotamia in what is modern-day southern Iraq, and eventually established the thriving city-states like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash as early as 3000 BCE. In addition to being population centers, these cities were cultural, economic, political, and religious hubs that shaped every aspect of life in early civilization. The very idea of urbanism, or the idea of life clustered around monumental architecture and institutions and infrastructure, as opposed to variable hunting grounds and season-dependent flora and fauna-rich regions, or even small farming communities, can all be traced to these ancient river basin settlements. By around 3000 BCE, Uruk, a city which we addressed a fair amount in the previous episode, was surrounded by a 6-mile-long wall, which was punctuated with defensive towers every 30 to 35 feet. The city spanned about 1,000 acres. In a region with little in the way of natural defenses, the walls of Uruk and other Sumerian cities offered security from the frequent and unpredictable warfare that defined the Mesopotamian landscape. The Sumerians built massive and architecturally complex buildings. Most dwellings in Sumerian cities were constructed from sun-dried mud brick, a resource that was abundant. Mud bricks were easily shaped by hand and could be left to bake in the hot sun until they were hard enough to use for building. But despite the ease with which the mud brick could be made, the lack of access to other important building materials like stone or timber forced the Sumerians to use ingenuity to use the mud bricks effectively. They pioneered features like the arch to help them construct vast structures that dwarfed anything previously built. The most prominent of these structures was the temple, often built atop a ziggurat or a massive stepped tower that physically and symbolically elevated the god of the city. In addition to being places of worship, these temples were economic centers for redistributing goods, overseeing production and serving as the political nerve center of the city. The god or goddess of each city was believed to own the city itself. This belief made each city a theocracy governed under divine authority. Within the temple, there were impressive houses for the priests and priestesses of each city's god, and they also oversaw the running of the temple and its property. It's possible that in the early stages of some city-states, priests and priestesses played an important role in ruling because of the power they had from controlling the temple and its resources. Though in practice, kings and not priests actually held the reins. Speaking of Sumerian kings, a Sumerian king was called a lugal, which literally means a great man. Usually they started as a powerful military leader, but with time, they became religious figures and legal arbiters and patrons of monumental architecture. They lived in vast palaces staffed by servants and officials, and they commanded armies that included both infantry and war chariots. Their power was broad and often dynastic, passing control down from father to son, and the lugal's wife, or the nin, also played a public role, reflecting the partnership that underpinned their dynastic continuity. Importantly, Sumerian cities weren't just their urban centers. Each ruled over a surrounding territory of farmland and smaller villages. Some cities were small, with populations under 10,000, and others reached 50,000 or more. And each city had its own pantheon of gods, its own political structures, and its own ambitions. Some rulers were titled lords or governors. Others elevated themselves to the role of lugal and claimed authority over surrounding cities. There was a cultural but not a political hegemony across the Sumerian city-states. The internal organization of these cities was rigidly hierarchical. At the top were kings, nobles, and priests, those who represented the gods and wielded real power. Below them were soldiers, artisans, and farmers, the productive classes, and at the bottom were slaves, who played a supporting role in construction, agriculture, and household labor. And yet, despite this rigid social structure and ever-present threat of violence from unpredictable and powerful rivers or menacing rivals, Sumerian cities flourished. They became centers of writing, architecture, religion, and trade, and their influence rippled outward, shaping the rest of Mesopotamia and future civilizations across the ancient world. At its core, the economy of the Sumerian city-states was agricultural. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was very fertile, though unpredictable, hence the development of dams, irrigation systems, and reservoirs that we outlined in the previous episode. After the Sumerians drained the marshes and redirected water through irrigation channels, they created productive fields of barley and groves of date palms. Their success transformed the landscape, but Sumer was more than a land of farmers. Over time, commerce and industry became increasingly important. The cities of Mesopotamia developed vibrant economies producing woolen textiles, pottery, and intricate metalwork. These goods were traded both locally and across vast distances. The invention of the wheel allowed merchants to use carts to haul goods farther and faster than ever before. By land, Mesopotamian traders ventured as far as the eastern Mediterranean. By sea, they traveled to the civilizations of the Indus Valley. They exported dried fish, wool, barley, and the finely crafted goods of their metalworkers. In return, they imported copper and tin for bronze, aromatic woods, exotic fruit trees, stone, silver, and precious timbers like cedars and cypress from distant lands. Traders even brought ivory from Africa and rare essences from the Mediterranean. This early web of international commerce made Mesopotamia a pioneer in global trade. In fact, Mesopotamians developed the earliest forms of what we might now call business law. Governments regulated commerce, requiring that transactions be written down. Business fraud was punished harshly, and a standardized system of weights and measures ensured fairness. Interest rates on loans were monitored, and priests and royal officials kept meticulous records. Many of the oldest examples of writing in cuneiform are evidences of this commercial development. Many of the oldest tablets are just receipts, contracts, and records of inventories. Mesopotamia offered considerable room for private enterprise, especially compared to other ancient civilizations. Temple priests held a powerful position in economic life, owning land, collecting rent, and redistributing the surplus. But over time, independent merchants carved out space to operate as entrepreneurs. They evolved beyond being middlemen for the temple or palace, and they began to form their own trading firms and networks, and some even established outposts in foreign lands. Still, trade was often a royal monopoly. Kings and officials controlled the movement of luxury goods and foreign imports, ensuring that wealth flowed through the palace and the temple. Mesopotamian economic life was never entirely stable. These city-states were constantly at war, competing over trade routes, water rights, and arable land. Geography did them no favors. There were no mountains or deserts to serve as natural defenses defenses. A neighboring army could appear with little warning, with rival cities being only 50 or 60 miles away. And so the logic of economics became intertwined with the logic of war. The best defense in many people's minds was conquest. Cities sought to dominate their neighbors to secure resources and preempt attacks. But behind the military exploits and royal pageantry was a remarkably sophisticated economic engine. In addition to the agriculture, the large-scale trade of luxury goods, and the collective efforts in infrastructure building, the Sumerians traded knowledge. Along with their pottery, metal tools, and grain, they carried writing, artistic motifs, and religious ideas to distant cultures. This spread of ideas helped them to create a shared culture. Their language, religion, and practices were similar from city to city. They may have emphasized different gods from one city to the next, but their temples and palaces looked strikingly similar. Yet they sometimes competed violently to control trade routes and access to fresh water, and of course agriculturally productive land. Much of their culture was tied to that resource scarcity. The Sumerian city-states were highly stratified. Broadly speaking, there were four major social classes: the elites, the dependent commoners, the free commoners, and slaves. The elites included kings, the lugals, as I previously mentioned, nobles, high officials, and priests, along with their families. These individuals controlled religion, the government, and military affairs, which came with land, access to resources, and obviously significant power. This is what made the palaces and temples the political and economic centers of city life. Beneath them were dependent commoners, individuals who were legally free but worked the land or engaged in craft labor on behalf of the palace or temple. These people didn't own the land they worked. They received food, housing, or other forms of compensation from elite institutions. Though their lives were difficult, they were tied to powerful households, which offered a measure of security. Next were the free commoners, including farmers, merchants, fishers, artisans, and scribes, who made up the bulk of the population. Some estimates suggest that over 90% of Mesopotamians were farmers. They worked small plots of land, sometimes their own property, and sometimes leased property, and they sold or traded their crops in the city's markets. Scribes, a smaller but crucial class, were trained in writing and found work in temples, palaces, and merchant houses. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were slaves. Though the nature of slavery in early Mesopotamia was distinct from what would come later in history, most people, at least in the United States, think of chattel slavery in the antebellum American South. But that is only one form of slavery, and we'll see many different iterations of slavery over the millennia. Slavery in Sumer was not yet racialized. Anyone could become a slave, whether through war, crime, debt, or destitution. Most slaves were prisoners of war or criminals whose freedom had been revoked. Some voluntarily entered slavery to repay debts, trading years of service for a chance at a future. Slaves were used in a variety of ways. Palace officials employed them in construction. Temple authorities relied on enslaved women to weave textiles and to grind grain. Wealthy landowners used slaves in domestic labor and agriculture. Some slaves were even permitted to engage in commerce. They could borrow money, conduct transactions, and in many cases purchase their own freedom. In that sense, Mesopotamian slavery, while brutal and dehumanizing, was more fluid than in later systems. Still, the reality of slavery was grim. Foreign slaves could be held indefinitely and treated as property. They could be bought, sold, branded, and beaten. Some had their bondage limited to 3 years, but others were slaves for life. The temple economy in particular consumed vast amounts of labor, often through enslaved women and children. In this society, human bodies were resources, tools of labor, much like animals or land. This commodification of people was foundational to how power and wealth were generated. Gender played an important role in defining social experience. Most elite landowners were men, but women could and did own property. Queens and priestesses could control large estates and manage them independently. Some women operated businesses and kept financial accounts. Sumerian daughters inherited property as dowries, which was technically theirs, though it was often managed by their husband or in-laws. And while power was overwhelmingly patriarchal, the presence of powerful women in both religious and economic spheres suggests that Sumerian gender norms were complex and varied by class. Despite inequality and exploitation, the Sumerians created the basic template for urban civilization. They left behind not just physical remnants of their civilization in temples and clay tablets, but also systems, social roles, labor relationships, gender norms, and civic institutions that continue to shape the broader Mesopotamian world for centuries. The Sumerians' city building helped to organize their society and to drive a complex economy. but perhaps no area of their culture better reveals their ingenuity than their science and technology. Mesopotamian innovation wasn't the product of ideal conditions, it was a response to an unpredictable world. Both their gods and their environment were volatile, and so the Sumerians cultivated a high degree of self-reliance and practical intelligence. This made them some of the most technologically innovative people of the ancient world. Despite having no local mineral deposits, the Sumerians became skilled metal workers. Trade routes brought in copper from distant lands, and by the Uruk period of 4000 BCE to 3100 BCE, copper was being smelted in Sumerian cities and fashioned into tools and weapons. But copper alone wasn't enough. Around 3000 BCE, they began combining copper with arsenic and later tin to produce bronze. For nearly 2 millennia, bronze remained the strongest metal known to humans. In warfare, in craft, and in agriculture, bronze defined Mesopotamian technological strength, hence why we call it the Bronze Age. I already mentioned the development of the wheel in Sumer. The Sumerians were using potter's wheels by the mid-4th millennium BCE to help them create smooth, uniform, and intricate pieces of pottery. But by 3200 BCE, they had adapted the wheel for transport. They built 2- and 4-wheeled carts and chariots that were pulled by donkeys. This revolutionized trade, allowing heavy goods to be moved more efficiently, but also transformed warfare. The earliest known image of a chariot trampling an enemy dates to about 2600 BCE. Now, it's easy to assume that once the wheel was invented for pottery, its use for transport was inevitable. But that wasn't the case. Ancient Egyptians, for example, used the potter's wheel long before they adopted the wheel for chariots, only doing so after learning the technique from Mesopotamia. The Sumerians were solving real problems, transporting goods, defending cities, managing labor, and their technology reflected that. There are ample reasons to invent something as versatile as the wheel. However, the landscape and geography of Sumer, the trade networks, and their need to adapt to specific challenges were the driving factors in the wheel's creation, its development, and adaptation for a variety of uses. Perhaps no tool better captures the Sumerian ingenuity than the Sumerian plow with seed drill. Instead of scattering seeds by hand, this tool deposited seeds directly into the furrow, increasing efficiency and crop yields. It was in use for thousands of years and is depicted on stone carvings. Yet no comparable technology existed in the West until the 19th century of the Common Era. The Sumerians had developed a technology centuries ahead of its time, driven by the demands of sustaining life in an uncertain environment. The Mesopotamians also made tremendous advances in mathematics, a field driven by practical needs like land surveying, irrigation, management, and trade. To coordinate their elaborate canal systems, they developed precise measuring tools and even created maps. Their system of mathematics gave us our modern divisions of time, the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds, the circle into 360 degrees. Their grasp of geometry and arithmetic enabled them to build architectural features like domes and arches long before the Romans would claim them as hallmarks of Western civilization. Their lunar calendar was based on 12 months of 29 or 30 days, which of course required regular corrections with an extra month added every few years in order to align properly with the seasons. Mesopotamian astronomy began with careful observations. Babylonian priests recorded the movements of planets and stars, correlating them with seasonal changes and royal events. But they didn't yet think in terms of physical laws. For the Mesopotamians, the heavens were divine. The sky revealed the will of the gods, not the rules of the universe. Astronomy then was more divination than science, used to time festivals, advise kings, and predict omens. The same logic applied to medicine. Illness was believed to be the result of angry gods or invading demons. Healing required priest-physicians to perform rituals, sacrifices, and incantations. But at the same time, Mesopotamians demonstrated real medical knowledge. They diagnosed symptoms, they developed remedies, and recorded pharmacological recipes. So even with their religious framework, they were building empirical knowledge or observation and experimentation recorded in clay, so it can be passed along and expounded upon. Sumerian scribes also developed early mathematical texts, including multiplication and division tables, calculations for areas of triangles and rectangles, and even work with cubes and cube roots, and later Babylonians built on this legacy. As practical as these developments were, the Sumerians rarely formalized the underlying theory. What mattered wasn't abstract principle, It was whatever worked. And when they found something that worked, they maximized its usefulness. Nothing highlights that better than their contribution to the written word. I touched upon the development of writing in the previous episode, but it is worth repeating just how impressive and important writing was to the Sumerians and future civilization in the Near East, Mediterranean, and beyond. The Sumerians developed cuneiform, which was a way of writing and not a specific language. In its initial form, it was not used to express poetry, though they eventually did, but to record economic transactions. From there, writing expanded to include law codes, medical recipes, religious texts, and everything in between. The subsequent civilizations adopted cuneiform for wide-ranging Semitic and even Indo-European languages, and it remained in use for thousands of years. Even as later scripts like the Phoenicians, Greeks, and Latin simplified the act of writing, they trace their origins back to cuneiform. If you ever visit an ancient history museum like the Oriental Institute at my alma mater, the University of Chicago, I encourage you to seek out some of the clay tablets whose abundance and durability facilitated the development and the spread of writing. You will note just how small they are and just how challenging it would be to write on them. And write on them they did. The scribal schools that the Sumerians established helped to create, maintain, and promote this literary tradition. The scribes, who were the sons of elites, mastered the use of cuneiform. Fortunately for the human record, hundreds of clay tablets survived from these schools, showing that mastering cuneiform required years of rote learning. Textbooks from the time period included word lists, including bilingual dictionaries for translating from Sumerian into Akkadian, which was a Semitic language and not related to Sumerian at all, and math problems with worked out solutions. Though most scribes were male, some women, especially from noble families, also became literate and are mentioned in official records. The oldest work of a known author was by Enheduanna, who was the daughter of Sargon the Great and a high priestess of the moon god Nana. She wrote hymns that have been preserved and held both religious and political authority. Graduates of these schools found work in temples, palaces, merchant houses, and courts. Their skills gave them social mobility and solidified the role of writing as a pillar of civilization. Through scribes, ideas could travel across cities, across empires, and across generations. What makes all this more impressive is the Sumerians' lack of resources. I said it before and I'll say it again. They lived in a land with no timber, no stone, and no metals. Yet, they developed metallurgy. They lived far from the centers of copper and tin production, and yet they built the Bronze Age. They faced unpredictable flooding, yet they developed sophisticated irrigation. They lacked access to celestial observatories, yet they still measured the heavens. How? Some innovations were out of necessity. Some were reactions to their location. But above all, the Sumerians were not isolated. They traveled the rivers, the deserts, and the seas. They traded not just goods, but ideas, sending stories, symbols, and technologies far beyond their cities. They influenced Egyptian artisans, the Indus Valley traders, and later Mediterranean peoples. They were the originators of what we now call civilizational diffusion, or the spread of cultural traits, ideas, and practices from one region to another. When we consider the development of any civilization, its belief system plays an enormous role in our understanding of its culture, its values, and its sense of identity. For the Sumerians and their successors, religion was the organizing principle for all existence. Politics, law, economics, art, architecture, even the calendar and the clock, each was subordinated to an overriding religious worldview. At the heart of each city was a ziggurat. They were massive platforms that supported temples where deities were believed to reside. And the temple, which clearly played an outsized role in daily life, as I've already pointed out, in addition to their religious functions, they were central economic institutions. They even coordinated large-scale trade. For instance, wool was a major export. Vast flocks of sheep produced textiles that fueled Mesopotamia's economy, and much of the city's textile production was handled by temple estates that employed vast numbers of workers, many of them enslaved women and children. They played a role in the innovations that shaped the Sumerians. One of our absolute earliest examples of writing comes from a partial tablet from the Temple of Uruk, and it simply reads, "Temple, sheep, God, and Nana," demonstrating just how important the temple was in every facet of their lives. The Sumerians were polytheists, believing in many gods, each of whom governed some part of the cosmos. They saw divine forces everywhere, in the moon and sun, in rivers and storms, in grain that sprouted or withered. Their gods were not abstract ideals, they were anthropomorphic beings with personalities, rivalries, and appetites. And just like Mesopotamian society, the gods were ranked in a hierarchy. At the top stood the four creator gods: An, who was the god of the sky; Enlil, who was the god of the air; Anki was the god of water; and Nihirsag, the god of earth. These deities birthed lesser gods to govern specific forces: sun and moon, fertility and war, love and the underworld. Cities had patron gods. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, and the planet Venus watched over Uruk. Enlil ruled from Nippur. The gods didn't just rule nature, they ruled people too. War, disease, famine, death, all of these were considered divine reckonings. In a land racked by unpredictable floods and warfare and disease, religion offered explanation, but not comfort. The Mesopotamians believed the gods were capricious or easily angered and very difficult to please. Prosperity came from divine favor, but no one could be sure what would please the gods on any given day. Misfortunes were read as punishment, but success too was understood not as the result of one's efforts, but of a god's benevolence. This created a culture of anxiety and appeasement. To avoid disaster, people offered prayers, sacrifices, and gifts. Priests clothed and fed the gods' statues in great temple complexes, some of which, like the ziggurat of Ur, stood atop multi-level platforms visible for miles. Cities didn't merely worship gods, they belonged to them. The city of Uruk wasn't ruled by humans, it was the possession of Inanna. Kings too allied themselves with the divine. While not considered gods themselves, as in Egypt, Sumerian kings claimed to rule on behalf of the gods. They often performed priestly functions, and royal inscriptions emphasized how kings built temples, consulted omens, and brought divine order to the world. This divine endorsement justified their rule. For all their religious devotion, the Sumerians had a very grim view of the afterlife. They did not believe in heaven or hell. They believed the dead descended to a shadowy underworld, dark, dusty, and full of sorrow, where they lived as spirits cut off from the gods. To prevent hauntings, families buried their dead under the homes, often with goods for use in the afterlife, but even these offerings were more about placating the dead than honoring them. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the most famous Mesopotamian literary work, captures the mood of spiritual despair. In one scene, Gilgamesh mourns the death of his friend Enkidu and sets out in search of eternal life. He finds instead a terrible truth: the gods have allotted immortality to themselves, and to humans only death. And in a deeply human moment and a profound expression of Mesopotamian existential pessimism, Gilgamesh says, "What my brother is now, that shall I be when I am dead. I am afraid of death." Mesopotamian religion was steeped in myth. In one tale of Inanna's descent to the underworld, she is captured, her body turned to rotting meat. Eventually she is rescued, but only if someone else takes her place. A myth likely linked to the cyclical disappearance and reappearance of the planet Venus. These stories were performed in rituals, used to interpret natural phenomena, and recited as expressions of cultural identity. Humans, the myths explained, were created to serve the gods, to build their temples, offer them food, and maintain their cities. As such, everything from irrigation systems to legal codes bore religious weight. Kings did not pass laws, they received them from the gods. Priests examined livers, dreams, and the stars to determine divine will. City wars were understood as battles between the gods of those cities. Religion was not separate from politics or science, it was their justification. This deep intertwining of faith and function made Mesopotamian religion not just a belief system, but a total worldview, one that governed thought, behavior, and social structure. Religion provided the blueprint for their society. Perhaps no story better illustrates the reach of Mesopotamian religion more than the flood narrative. It is found in tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. It recounts how the gods, angered by human noise and disruption, resolved to drown the world. But one god, Ea, warned a righteous man named Utnapishtim and told him to build a boat. He loaded it with animals and family, sealed it, and endured 7 days and nights of storms and flood. When the waters receded, he released a dove, and then a swallow, and finally a raven. The raven did not return, and Utnapishtim knew it was safe. He offered a sacrifice. The gods, smelling its sweetness, regretted their actions. Enlil, the chief god, relented and blessed Utnapishtim and his wife with eternal life. This story predates the Hebrew account in the Bible of Genesis by over 1,000 years. But the similarities are striking. In both stories, a divine decision is made to flood the earth in response to human behavior. In both, a righteous man, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Noah in the Genesis story, is warned in advance and instructed to build a boat. Both men save animals and family and survive the flood, and after all that, they offer a sacrifice. And in both stories, the hero releases birds, first a raven, then a dove, to test if the floodwaters have receded. But the tone and theology differ dramatically. In Genesis, the flood is a moral judgment. Human wickedness leads to divine cleansing, followed by a covenant never to repeat the act. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood is almost arbitrary, the result of divine annoyance. The gods are divided. Some regret their decision, others are angry at the survivor. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, there is no promise, there's no rainbow, and there is no divine moral. And yet both stories reflect a shared cultural memory of a catastrophic flood, probably linked to ancient Mesopotamian flooding events or even deeper Ice Age transitions. The tale was passed along oral networks, eventually entering different theological and literary frameworks, but the structure remained, including the boat, the birds, the storm, the survival, and the sacrifice. These similarities reveal something important. Ancient peoples in the Near East were not living in isolated silos. As I've said, ideas traveled. Myths were shared, adapted, reinterpreted, and through that transmission, the Mesopotamian religious imagination helped shape global religious thought. Religion in Mesopotamia was about more than temples and myths. It was a way to explain suffering and to manage chaos and to justify authority, and above all, to grapple with mortality. It offered no salvation, only service. It did not offer any paradise, only a compulsion to piety. But in that struggle between fear and faith, between despair and ritual, the Mesopotamians gave us some of humanity's oldest, deepest, most powerful questions about our place in the cosmos. From towering ziggurats to finely etched cuneiform tablets, from the rhythms of barley harvests to hymns sung in anxious devotion to the gods, Mesopotamian culture and society offer us one of the oldest and most complete portraits of urban life. The Sumerians and their neighbors built a civilization of remarkable complexity in a land with few natural advantages. They wrestled with floods, droughts, and scarcity, yet their ingenuity produced writing, mathematics, monumental architecture, and religious traditions that rippled far beyond their own time and place. At the heart of their story is a tension between chaos and order, the human and the divine. Fragility and endurance. Their gods were unpredictable, their environment unstable, but they created systems of worship, of labor, of knowledge that allowed them to survive and even to flourish. And in the process, they gave us some of humanity's oldest attempts to make sense of the cosmos and our place within them. In our next episode, we'll turn from society and culture to power and ambition as we explore how Mesopotamian city-states became the world's first empires. I hope you'll join me for that journey. Until then, remember, history isn't just about kings and battles. It's also about scribes and farmers, myths and rituals, and the enduring human search for meaning in a chaotic world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, stay curious.